I was 11 years old when my mother locked me out of the house and went to a rooftop party with her friends. It wasn't the first time she forgot about me, but it was the first time I realized she didn't care. My name is Caleb, and I grew up in a house most people would call a mansion. My father, Harrison, was a self-made businessman who built a successful construction company from the ground up. He wasn't just good at his job, he was exceptional. Because of him, we never had to worry about money. My mother, Celeste, was different. She never worked, but that was exactly how she wanted it. While my father spent long hours managing projects and negotiating contracts, she spent her days at high-end boutiques, luxury spas, and private clubs with her equally privileged friends. She had no responsibilities, no worries, and most of all, no interest in being a mother. Dad was the kind of man who believed in love. He thought providing a good life for my mother would be enough to make her happy. So when she spent thousands on clothes or hosted extravagant parties in our house, he let it slide. When she came home late from her ladies' nights, smelling of expensive perfume and cocktails, he sighed but said nothing. And when she forgot to pick me up from school or left me waiting at home alone for hours, he always made excuses for her. But one night, everything changed. Dad had to go on a last-minute business trip to another state. I heard him talking to Mom in the kitchen before he left. "Caleb needs to be picked up from practice at 5. He reminded her, his voice firm but patient. "Set an alarm if you need to." Mom rolled her eyes. "I'm not an idiot, Harrison. I can handle my own son for a few days." That was the last thing he heard before he kissed my forehead, grabbed his suitcase, and walked out the door. That afternoon, I waited outside the gym after practice, scanning the parking lot for my mother's car. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. I pulled out the emergency phone my dad had given me and called her. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. I wasn't scared. Not at first. I had walked home before when she was late, but when I got to the house, my stomach twisted. The gates were shut, the lights were off, and I didn't have a key. Our neighbor, Mrs. Langley, was watering her roses when she spotted me standing outside. Her lips pressed together in a worried frown. "Caleb, honey," she called, stepping closer. "Your mother left hours ago. I heard her on the phone talking about some rooftop party downtown." A cold knot formed in my chest. I tried calling her again, and again. No response. I sat on the front steps, hugging my backpack as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air turned cold. Mrs. Langley came out with a blanket and a sandwich, her gaze filled with something I didn't recognize at the time, but later understood to be pity. Hours passed. My mother never came home. Finally, I did the only thing I could. I called my dad. "Daddy," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I'm locked out. Mom's not home. I don't know what to do." There was silence on the line, followed by a sharp inhale. Then his voice, steady but laced with something dark. "Stay with Mrs. Langley tonight. I'm coming home." "But Dad, your trip. I'll be there as soon as I can." And he was. He drove through the night, crossing 2 states without stopping. By the time he arrived at 3 a.m., his face was pale with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with something I had never seen before. Rage. Mrs. Langley offered him coffee, but he shook his head, thanked her, and took me home. We sat in the dimly lit living room, waiting. I should have been scared of what would happen when Mom walked through that door, but all I felt was numb. The clock struck 7 when we heard the front door unlock. She waltzed in like nothing had happened, her designer dress wrinkled, her makeup smudged, her hair a tangled mess. The smell of alcohol clung to her like cheap perfume. Then she saw my father. Her eyes widened. "Harrison? What are you doing home?" Dad didn't move. His voice was calm, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. "Our son was locked outside for hours last night because his mother was too busy partying to remember he existed." Mom let out a breathy, dismissive laugh. Oh, come on, don't be dramatic. Caleb's fine, aren't you, sweetheart? She reached for me, but I pulled away. Dad stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. His voice, when he spoke, was razor sharp. He called me crying, Celeste. He tried to reach you for hours. What if something had happened to him? She rolled her eyes. I just lost track of time, that's all. The girls and I were having such a great night. The girls? His voice thundered through the house. Your son should come before your damn friends and their rooftop parties. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across my mother's face. But it wasn't fear of losing me. It was fear of losing the life my father had given her. She collapsed onto the couch, fake tears spilling down her cheeks. I'm sorry. I swear it won't happen again. Dad exhaled, long and slow. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, We'll see about that. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of the end for my family. And for my mother, it was the beginning of her downfall. I stood outside my own house, suitcase in hand, while my mother and her fiancé celebrated inside. I had been thrown away like I was nothing. After my father's funeral, my mother, Celeste, didn't even pretend to grieve. She wore black for a week, hosted a lavish wake, and let the world believe she was a devoted widow. But the moment the last mourner left, it was as if my father had never existed. The house was suddenly filled with laughter and music. Expensive champagne flowed as my mother entertained her friends, gushing about how she was finally free. She spent hours on the phone, whispering in the corner about new opportunities and fresh starts. I tried to ignore it. I locked myself in my room, clinging to my father's memory, wearing his old sweater just to feel close to him. But the walls weren't thick enough to block out her voice. He left me with nothing, she had hissed one night. That stupid business trust. He tied it all up so I couldn't touch it. But it doesn't matter. I'll figure something out. I should have known then. I should have seen it coming. One morning, I came downstairs and saw a man in the kitchen. He was standing at the coffee machine like he owned the place, casually sipping from my father's favorite mug. He was younger than my mother by at least 15 years, tall, tanned, and dripping with artificial charm. Oh, good. You're here, Celeste said, appearing beside him. Caleb, meet Grayson, my fiancé. I nearly dropped my plate. You're what? My fiancé, she repeated, slower this time, as if I was too stupid to understand. And now that you're here, we need to talk about arrangements. Something in my gut twisted. What arrangements? Celeste gave me a thin smile. You need to leave. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. This is my house, too. Her expression hardened. No, it's not. Your father is gone now, and his money is mine. I can finally live the way I want, with who I want. She ran her fingers along Grayson's arm like he was a prize she had just won. And that doesn't include a grown teenager sulking around. I took a step back, my heart pounding. You're kicking me out? She let out a small laugh, as if I was being ridiculous. Then she turned, walked upstairs, and came back down with my suitcase. She started throwing my clothes into it without even folding them. You're 19, Caleb. I don't have to take care of you anymore, she said, tossing in my shoes. I want you gone within the hour. I stood there, frozen, while she packed up my life like I was an unwanted guest overstaying my welcome. Mom, please. She slammed the suitcase shut and shoved it into my arms. Don't mom me, she snapped. I've done my duty. I raised you. Now it's time for me to be happy. Grayson smirked from the doorway. Maybe it's for the best, kid. Time to grow up, huh? I wanted to punch him. Instead, I gritted my teeth, grabbed my suitcase, and walked out the door. The moment it shut behind me, I felt it. An emptiness so deep it made my knees weak. I had no grandparents, no aunts or uncles. My father had been an only child, and my mother's family had cut her off years ago. I had no one. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and called the only person I could think of. Shirley picked up on the second ring. Caleb? The moment I told her what happened, she didn't even hesitate. Come over right now. Shirley and her mom lived in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment across town. They didn't have much, but when I arrived, they made room for me. Her mom pulled out the guest blankets, set up the couch, and even bought me a pillow the next day. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling completely lost. My father had been gone for less than a month, and my mother had already erased him. And me. The next week passed in a blur. I threw myself into my final exams, using my studies as a distraction. I had no idea what I was going to do after graduation. College felt impossible now that I had no home and no money. Every time I thought about the future, panic crept in. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call. The number was unfamiliar. Caleb Mitchell? A voice said when I picked up. My name is Paul Weston. I'm a notary public, and I need you to come to my office as soon as possible. It's regarding your father's will. My heart nearly stopped. My father's will? Yes, he said, his voice serious but kind. I've been handling some matters remotely, but this requires your presence. There's something you need to see. I hung up and sat there, my pulse racing. My mother had told me my father left her everything, that there was nothing for me. Had she lied? I had no idea what I was about to walk into. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. I felt hope. I sat in the waiting room of Paul Weston's office, my leg bouncing with restless energy. The walls were lined with thick law books, and the scent of aged paper mixed with fresh coffee lingered in the air. The receptionist gave me a polite smile, but I barely noticed. My mind was spinning. My father's will. Why hadn't my mother mentioned this? She had made it sound like everything belonged to her, that I had nothing. A door creaked open. Mr. Mitchell? A deep voice called. I stood up. A man in his 60s, dressed in a crisp gray suit, extended his hand. I'm Paul Weston. Thank you for coming. He led me into a spacious office where a thick folder sat open on his desk. The moment I sat down, he got straight to the point. Your father made some very specific arrangements before he passed, he said, adjusting his glasses. The house, its contents, and the entire proceeds from the sale of his business. All of it has been left to you. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. I don't understand, I stammered. My mother said she inherited everything. Mr. Weston exhaled, his expression unreadable. She was misinformed. I sat frozen as he flipped through the legal documents pointing to my name, printed clearly in black ink. Everything. The house. The money. Every asset my father had accumulated. I wasn't broke. I wasn't homeless. I owned everything. And my mother had lied. Your father was very thorough in his planning, Mr. Weston continued. He anticipated complications, which is why he structured his will so that the assets would be transferred directly to you upon your 19th birthday. Your mother has no legal claim to them. A shaky breath left my lips. I barely heard the rest of what he said. I had power. For weeks, I had felt helpless. Cast aside, disposable. But now, my mother wasn't the one in control. I was. Then Mr. Weston reached into the folder and pulled out an envelope. Your father also left you this. He slid it across the desk. He was very clear that you should read it in private. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. My father's. My dearest Caleb. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. I'm so sorry, son. There's so much I wanted to see. Your graduation, your future, the man you will become. But life doesn't always give us what we want. What I can give you, though, is protection. I need to tell you something difficult. I've known for a while about your mother's affairs. I know about her lover, about her plans for my money. I've overheard her on the phone too many times, planning her future. A future that doesn't include you. My hands clenched around the paper. This isn't revenge. This is me making sure you are safe. You were the only one who sat with me through my illness, the only one who held my hand without complaint, who loved me unconditionally. Your mother will keep the car and the jewelry I bought her over the years. Those are hers. But everything else, the house, the money from my business, it's yours. You can help her if you want to, but that's your choice. I just wanted to make sure she could never hurt you again. Love always, Dad. My throat tightened. My father had known. He had seen through her lies even as he was dying. He had protected me in the only way he could. When I finally looked up, Mr. Weston was silent, giving me space to process it all. I don't know what to say, I admitted. You don't have to say anything, he said gently. Just decide what you want to do next. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. I already knew what I was going to do. As I walked out of the office, a plan was forming in my mind. My mother had thrown me out of my own house. She had celebrated her engagement in my home, drinking my father's wine with a man who didn't belong there. She had lied to me, deceived me, stolen from me. But the party was over, because the next time I stepped into that house, I wouldn't be a guest. I'd be the owner. Comment the number 1 if you want to see how Celeste will pay for this. I arrived at my mother's engagement party in the very house she had thrown me out of. The mansion was glowing with golden lights, music spilling out onto the perfectly manicured lawn. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and laughter echoed from the grand ballroom. She was celebrating. In my home. I tightened my grip on the folder in my hand. Tonight, that was going to change. I stepped inside. No one stopped me. My mother had never been the kind of person to care about security. She was too confident, too convinced that nothing could touch her. That was her first mistake. The living room was packed with people. My mother's friends, dressed in designer gowns, held champagne flutes as they laughed over meaningless gossip. I spotted Grayson, her fiancé, in the center of the room, entertaining a group of younger men who looked just as insufferable as he was. And then, I saw her. Celeste stood at the top of the grand staircase, basking in the attention of her guests. She wore an extravagant emerald dress, her hair styled to perfection, her jewelry glittering under the chandelier. She looked untouchable, but she wasn't. She met my eyes across the room. For a second I saw it. Her mask slipping. Shock. Fear. But then, like always, she recovered. She plastered on a fake smile and turned to her guests. "Oh, everyone," she called out, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "This is my son, Caleb. Poor thing just can't accept that it's time to stand on his own 2 feet." Laughter rippled through the room. I clenched my fists, but I didn't react. Not yet. Celeste descended the staircase slowly, her smile never faltering. "Tell me, darling, are you here to beg to come home?" I smiled back. Not a friendly smile, a knowing smile. "Actually," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm here to take back what's mine." Silence. Then a low chuckle from Grayson. "That's cute, kid." My eyes never left my mother's. "This house isn't yours, Celeste. None of this is." Her face paled. "Don't be ridiculous. Everything here belongs to me." I reached into my folder and pulled out the will. I lifted it high for everyone to see. "This house belongs to me," I said, my voice unwavering. "So does everything in it. My father left it all to me. The house, the money from his business, everything. You get to keep your car and the jewelry you bought with his money. That's it." The room went dead silent. I turned toward the crowd. If you're drinking my father's champagne, standing on my property, and you don't want to be accused of trespassing, I suggest you leave now. People moved. Coats were grabbed, murmurs filled the air, and within moments, the once lively engagement party collapsed. Celeste stood frozen, her perfect world crumbling in real time. "You're lying," she whispered. "You're making this up." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Would you like to read it? Or should I call the police to remove you from my house?" Grayson backed away. He looked between me and Celeste, realization dawning on his face. He wasn't engaged to a wealthy widow. He was engaged to a broke, aging woman with nothing to offer. "Celeste?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe we should—" Celeste grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. No, don't listen to him. We can fight this. We can get a lawyer." I let out a short, humorless laugh. Dad made sure everything was legally bulletproof. But hey, feel free to waste whatever money you have left on lawyers. That was when it happened. The exact moment Grayson saw her for what she truly was. Not the glamorous, wealthy woman he thought he was marrying. Not the perfect socialite. Just a desperate, selfish woman who had nothing left. He stepped back. "Maybe we should take some time. Process all this." Celeste's face crumbled. "Grayson, baby, don't do this. We can figure something out." But Grayson was already halfway to the door. He didn't even look back. She turned to me, her perfect makeup smudging, her breathing ragged. Rage burned in her eyes. "You ungrateful little—" "Don't," I cut her off. "Just don't." She clenched her fists, her entire body shaking. "You'll regret this, Caleb. You will regret this." I tilted my head. "Funny. That's exactly what Dad said about you." And then I pointed to the door. Celeste stood there, defeated, in the ruins of her own making. Outside, the neighbors were watching. Some were whispering. Some were smiling. Mrs. Langley, our old neighbor, gave me a nod of approval. As Celeste stepped outside, her whole body trembling, the crowd murmured. The queen had fallen, and for the first time in my life, I was finally free. The moment Celeste stepped outside, she knew. The world had seen her downfall. The once admired socialite, the glamorous widow, now nothing more than a disgraced woman standing in the cold. Her expensive heels clicked against the pavement as she spun around, eyes blazing. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "You think you've won?" I stepped forward, my voice steady. "It is over, Celeste, and I didn't win. Dad did." The crowd murmured. The neighbors who had once been polite to her were now openly watching. Mrs. Langley, the same woman who had given me a blanket the night my mother locked me out, crossed her arms. "This is what happens when you treat people like garbage," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. Celeste's face twisted in fury. "I'll get a lawyer," she spat. "I'll contest the will. I deserve that money." I shook my head. "You have no case. Dad made sure of it." Her breath hitched. "Then I'll—" The sound of an engine roaring to life cut her off. We all turned. Grayson. He was sitting in his sports car, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other tapping impatiently on the dashboard. He didn't even bother rolling down the window. "Are you coming or not?" he called. Celeste's face lit up. "Grayson, baby." But then, as if in slow motion, I saw the exact moment it happened. Grayson laughed. Actually laughed. And then, in a voice dripping with mock sympathy, he said, "Oh, honey, did you really think I was sticking around for this?" Celeste's expression shattered. Before she could respond, he hit the gas and sped off, leaving nothing behind but the sound of screeching tires. Silence. For the first time in her life, Celeste had no words. Her hands clenched, her shoulders shook. She turned back to me, her face a mask of barely contained rage. "You ruined my life." I let out a breath. No, Celeste, you did that all by yourself. She staggered back, her carefully constructed world collapsing piece by piece. The mansion? Gone. Her fiancé gone. Her wealth? Gone. And worst of all, her reputation. The same people who once envied her were now whispering, shaking their heads. A few of her so-called friends, the ones who had sipped champagne in her living room just hours ago, slinked away, pretending they didn't know her. That was the final blow. Celeste turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Life had changed. With my father's money, I went to college, just like he had planned. I moved into an apartment, a place I could finally call my own. Shirley and her mom were still in my life. I made sure they never had to worry about anything again. Mrs. Langley, too. I paid for her home repairs when I found out she had been struggling. As for Celeste, the last I heard, she had moved in with a distant cousin in a different state. She had no friends left, no money, and no way to rebuild the life she once had. She tried calling me a few times, leaving voicemails filled with fake apologies, crocodile tears, and desperate pleas for money. I never answered. I had already given her enough. I had given her my love, my trust, my patience, and she had thrown it all away. Now, I was finally free, and that was the real victory. Comment the number 1 if you think Celeste got exactly what she deserved. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories like this.